Welcome back to another Wayno's Photos video where we unpack the cycling BS. Well, anyway, I've got a bit of a different video today because I actually saw a Cannondale Systemsix ad on Instagram and they're claiming this to be the fastest bike on the planet, that meets the UCI rules. So I said, yeah, right, in a comment, and then they sent me the white paper that basically gives their argument for why this bike is the fastest bike on the planet. Well, anyway, I just thought we could go through this together and we could just unpack what the information is in this white paper. So let's roll that intro and let's get right into it. Well, this is the white paper put out by Cannondale in relation to their Systemsix bicycle. And they're saying the information in this white paper claims that their bicycle is the fastest bicycle on the planet within the UCI rules. Now, if I was evaluating this paper, I would say it's kind of a technical paper slash brochure because it doesn't really express the information like a normal paper from a university would, where it talks about the controls, how the controls were managed, and the variables. It does just briefly go over what they did, but doesn't really tell you how they actually did the test. But let's just put that aside because there actually is some good information in this paper. So I think we can all learn something from it. That's why I wanted to make this video, guys, for you. Well, on this page, they actually list the factors that they talk about in the actual paper. Now, if we go up here to these 6 points, we can actually see that the first point is rolling resistance. The second point is wheel bearing friction, and then drivetrain friction, then aerodynamic drag, then potential energy, then kinetic energy. But the last two more relate to the actual rider. But it's good how they actually use that information to explain certain things in the actual paper. Now we'll just expand that up so you can actually see that. And there are the 6 factors that they are considering. Now on this page we actually have 4 graphs. And this one graph here is the cycling power breakdown with velocity. And this actually talks about your velocity here. So you go from 0 to 60, and then you have your power in watts. And you can actually see that you need to have more watts to overcome the aero than you do to overcome the rolling resistance and wheel bearing and potential energy, because that stays pretty constant with increase of speed, and this one increases with the increase in speed. Now the second graph here is the resistive elements proportional of the total power with increasing velocity. So you can see that one starts off at 0, which is aero, because there's no aero effect at 0, and then increases. And then you actually have the rolling resistance, which at 0 is infinite, and then as you accelerate, it becomes less in relation to the amount of power you're putting out. So it actually is a ratio that they're talking about here, not the absolute resistance it's giving. Then we have the time saving in the 40 kilometers to TT. So basically what they do is give you seconds on this chart here, and then you have your athlete's power, which goes from 0 to 500. Now what is actually interesting, and actually say in the brochure, is that you actually get a bigger time gain at 100 watts than you do at 400 watts because you're actually riding for longer. So your benefit, even though it's less, actually adds up to a greater amount, which is actually quite interesting. And then we have the 4th graph here, which is the power saving for riders at different speeds given a drag reduction of 0.015 meters squared, which is what they say that they get a benefit from this bike. So as you can see here, your power saving at close to 0 is very little, which makes sense because there's no aero, but as the speed increases, your saving increases because the aero gains of the bike actually give more of a reduction. Now I gave you a bit of a close-up here of the graph so you can see the differences. Now the green line here is their bike, Systemsix, so they've highlighted that to show you that it's actually the fastest. And you can see at some yaw angles, we actually have some different bikes, like this one here with the triangle. If we go up to the triangle, the Cervelo S5 at 20 degrees in both negative and positive actually perform better. Why this one here is not quite as low as this side, I'm not too sure, because you would think that the bike is fairly symmetrical. But yeah, that's interesting data. And you can see here that, the Scott foil actually at the yaw angle performs quite poor compared to the other aero bikes. So there's some good information here. But again, we don't really know exactly how they did the test. They don't actually give you any details on the controls that they used. But let's give them the benefit of doubt and say that this data is fairly accurate. Now on this page we have the aerofoils, and if you look at this top aerofoil, that is a proper knacker shape. But the problem is when the manufacturers have to design their bicycles, the actual width and length cannot be designed into the bicycle frame because the UCI have actually written a rule specifically so you can't get that length and width to match that shape. And the UCI did this on purpose because in the 90s they wanted to get rid of the bikes like the Lotus bike and the super bikes that were one-piece bikes that had quite a big aero advantage. And they wanted to actually regulate that and stop manufacturers from making an aero bike. So the only way that they can actually achieve some sort of aero shape is the one that's lower down, where you can see that the tail's like chopped off. Now the manufacturers argue that, you know, the turbulence that comes off the back of this chopped off teardrop isn't that big, but the reality is it is, because as it hits that cliff, it actually turbulates. So you're creating turbulence. Once you create turbulence, you're actually creating drag. Now, this is a very interesting one here because we go testing without the rider. Now, they really briefly kind of gloss over this and say, oh, look, you know, results wouldn't vary very much with a rider, without a rider. But I argue to disagree. I'd like to challenge that because it's pretty common knowledge that when you put a rider onto a bicycle, that acts for about 80% of the drag. So the bicycle is only 20% of the drag. And of course, when you put the rider on your bicycle, it actually creates turbulent air around parts of the bike, which are around the back part of the bike and the seat post and all these sorts of parts. So therefore, the area advantage with the rider off is going to be greater than when the rider's on it, because there won't be clean air hitting these components. It'll be turbulated air because of the rider and the effect that the arms and body are having in turbulating the air and reducing the effectiveness of the aero components on the rear part of the bicycle. And also, when you take the rider off the bike and you talk about the aero gains, then they actually are calculated without a rider on. So when you actually apply those gains, which are, I'll show you in the graph that they showed earlier, then you actually reduce the percentage of benefit you're getting. And I'll show you the calculations for that in a minute. Well, in conclusion, I'd have to say that Cannondale did a pretty good job with this white paper, because most of the brands give you this percentage more aero, this percentage more compliant, and they give you no information to actually support any of that data. But Cannondale has actually give you, you know, some really significant information to back up that data, and you know, this is really quite scientific. And as I went through it, you can see that this is actually reasonable what they're saying. Now, there is a few things that they aren't telling you, and one of those things is that the savings that they're claiming on their graph, and now they've actually stated that this was done without the rider. So this is only about 20% of the performance, because it's pretty well known that the rider accounts for 80% of the drag and the bike accounts for about 20% of the drag. So that gain, that percentage gain, is without a rider, so it's only the bike. So if we then extrapolate that, it comes down to around about 0.5% gain in aerodynamics or in performance. So that's pretty small. And that's the reason why when you ride like a normal bike and an aero bike, you can't really feel a difference. So, you know, long story short, even though that they've gone to a lot of these bikes are quicker, right? The reality is that in the real world, it doesn't make that much difference. And you can actually make a much considerable difference just by changing your body position. And that's why when you go to a TT bike, they actually are faster, because you're not changing really the bike design, you're changing the body position mostly. And TT riders actually spend a hell of a lot of money and a lot of time trying to get their body into an optimal position to actually reduce that drag. Well, anyway, guys, I hope that explains it, and I hope you enjoyed the video, this type of format where we went through some technical data and basically explained that. If you've got any more interest in finding out about this paper, I'll put a link down below so you can go and read it for yourself. It's pretty interesting, so I recommend that. But that's where I'm going to leave it, guys. And if you've got any questions, leave your comments down below, and I'll see you next vid. Cheers.